I think Katrina was going to tell you a bit more about the EdTech Hub later in her presentation, so I was just going to quickly introduce the Girls' Education Challenge. I know a lot of people call it the GEC, but I call it the GEC, so I'll continue to do that. And so for anyone who doesn't know about the GEC, it's the UK's flagship, it's one of our big flagship programmes, and it's the world's largest programme dedicated to girls' education. It's been running since 2012 in various guises, and sadly is coming to an end next year with lots of projects already closed or closing. Altogether, the programme supported about 1.6 million marginalised girls with access to quality education in 41 projects in 17 countries. So as you can imagine, through all that time and through all those experiences, they've gathered kind of a wealth of lessons learned and evidence about how to implement these projects well over the 13 years of the programme. And so as the programme comes to an end, alongside continuing to deliver for the children it's still supporting, it's working hard to kind of share those lessons, and this is part of that effort. I'm sure you've already seen the learning brief on this topic, but if you look on their website, they've got learning briefs on all sorts of interesting things, and also a portfolio and practice series that brings together a bit more about how to actually get this work done. So that's why we're here today, for a deep dive into how EdTech has been used in the GEC and can be used in other projects to improve learning for girls and other marginalised children in low resource settings. Technology is obviously kind of already a core part and a growing part of our lives, and as I can hear myself. And as we're continuing to face disruption from pandemic, violence, and climate crises, EdTech, I think, is going to be an increasingly important part of how we respond to education. Can everyone else hear me? Or is that just me? Nope, that's better. Okay, sorry, I'll carry on. So we know that EdTech is important, but we also know that lots of investments in EdTech don't lead to improvements in learning outcomes, and some can actually exacerbate existing educational inequalities. But one thing I've always found really fascinating is that studies show that when girls and boys have equal access, girls often benefit more from technology, but there can be gender digital divide, so girls don't always have this opportunity. And today we're going to talk, my expert speakers are going to talk about what it looks like when EdTech investments are successful. So some examples of where we've seen technology enhance the education and lives of marginalised girls. So you'll know that we've got some really exciting speakers today. So Katrina Barnes from the EdTech Hub will tell us more about the research that the Hub have done to give us some answers to these questions. And then we'll deep dive into the experience from two GEC projects. Laura will share the work from Peas in Uganda, and then Mark and Shika will share learning from the Sisters for Sisters project in Nepal. And we'll come back to plenary at the end and should have about half an hour, I think, for questions and discussions. So like I said, please feel free to write comments and questions in the chat or just come in at the end. But I will stop talking now and pass over to Kat. Thanks, Kat.
Hi everybody, great to see you today. I'm Katrina and I'm here on behalf of the EdTech Hub, as Kate mentioned, which exists primarily to empower people by giving them the evidence they need to make decisions about technology and education. So we're here with this study today, which is contributing to that effort. I'll be presenting the findings from this study collaboration between the EdTech Hub and the Girls' Education Challenge. It was a relatively small-scale study focusing on the implementation of EdTech with the aim of improving education for marginalised girls, and was focused on projects within the GEC portfolio, which I will take you through shortly. Can I have the next slide, please? Kate has already told you a little bit about the GEC, so I won't spend too long here, but just to say that within this diverse portfolio, there has been a range of engagement with EdTech, as mentioned. On the one hand, you have some projects that have been built specifically around an EdTech intervention, and others that were actually engaged very little with EdTech or no EdTech at all prior to COVID-19. And then they brought on new EdTech activities to support remote learning during school closures. So there is a real diversity in the ways in which EdTech has been used across the portfolio that provided an interesting set of case studies for us in this research. Next slide, please. So there is an enduring gap and lack of studies dedicated to examining the implementation processes specifically that underpin effective delivery of EdTech interventions. So not just what works or does it work or not, but under what conditions does it work and what conditions are needed for EdTech interventions to achieve true impact. So that was really what we were focusing on in this study, not the what, but more the how and the why, to really answer some of those more nuanced questions. So based on this, we asked these two key research questions that you can see on the slide there. Firstly, what are the key factors relating to the implementation of EdTech interventions within GEC programmes that have facilitated successful implementation and intervention outcomes? And secondly, and relatedly, what lessons relating to the implementation of successful EdTech interventions within the GEC can be harnessed to optimise implementation for future programmes? So those were our two big focuses in this project. I'll take you through the methodology now very briefly. I'm keen to get onto the findings. Next slide, please. Thank you. Great. So we had a short list of projects which was developed based on emerging findings from the GEC's Value for Money report on EdTech within the GEC, which was written by Shah et al. And this focused on programmes identified as providing either good or promising value for money. So we therefore worked on the premise that the tech components used in these projects were both effective and cost effective overall. Through this process, 7 projects were identified and 6 were available to participate in our study. And these are the 6 that you see on the screen in front of you now. I'll take you through them in a very whistle-stop journey. There's much more I could say about them than I have time for here. But just very briefly, firstly, we had the Discovery Project 2, which was delivered by Impacted in Kenya, Ghana and Nigeria. And this delivered educational videos and TV broadcasts known as the My Better World series, which some of you may have heard of. Secondly, we had Gearing Up for Success After Schools, delivered by Peas in Uganda. And this introduced low tech during COVID-19 in the form of telephone trees, SMS messaging to connect teachers with students, and also radio lessons. Thirdly, we had the Inclusive Education in Kenya's Lake Programme project delivered by Leonard Cheshire in Kenya. And this primarily provided assistive technology to children with disabilities, including Orbit readers, Dolphin Supernova software, and Clicker 8 software. Fourthly, we had iMalango, delivered by Avanti Communications in a consortium in Kenya. And this focused on providing high-speed satellite broadband, computer labs and projectors, digital maths and literacy content, and an app during the COVID-19 closures. Next, we have Making Ghanaian Girls Great, also known as MG Cubed, which was delivered by Plan International in Ghana. This delivered live interactive satellite learning sessions projected into classrooms across the country. Finally, we have Let Our Girls Succeed, also the name there, WWW, which I won't attempt to pronounce, which was developed and delivered by the Education Development Trust in Kenya. And this focused on facilitating ICT integration for teaching, distributed tablets, projectors, introduced digital attendance monitoring, and facilitated radio lessons during COVID-19. Next slide, please. What do we do with these projects? Well, we had a few different data sources. Firstly, we used all available project documentation. So that's baselines, midlines, endlines, plus any available internal reports from these projects. We also did interviews with 18 project staff. Most of these were individual interviews, but we did do one focus group with the Leonard Cheshire team at their own request. And we also did some consultations with portfolio level staff at the GEC. We analysed all this data together using a framework developed according to the principles of implementation science, which was our theoretical basis here. And this is based on work of scholars such as Fixon et al. And Century and Casata. Very briefly, implementation science considers core components of a given intervention in relation to the organisational and external factors at play at different intervention stages. We therefore broke analysis of each intervention into its design and preparation components, implementation components, COVID-19 implementation components, and then also onward sustainability stages. All data was coded, mapped onto this analytical framework, and themes were identified. And I will be presenting some of these themes and sub-themes to you now and findings. Great. So from this analysis, 4 themes were identified, each composed of a number of sub-themes as well, that highlighted different core components of implementation in the sample projects. These themes are the ones that you see on the screen in front of you, so I won't read them all out. I'll now discuss each of these themes in turn, and we'll draw out examples from the different projects that best illustrate how these components looked in practice. Next slide, please. Thank you. So theme 1, evidence-informed design and delivery. Several sub-themes were housed under this broader theme of evidence-informed design. So firstly, the assessment of existing infrastructure. Across projects, there was a really strong perceived need to clearly understand the infrastructural context in which projects would be operating by mapping existing infrastructure or indeed lack thereof, and then to plan EdTech interventions accordingly. And this was both during regular programming and also during COVID-19. For example, GEAR staff reported gathering a significant amount of evidence on the reach and cost of different technology options, and they then based their COVID response design choices on this data. Secondly, consultation with community, taking a contextual, community-informed approach to evidence building in the project design phase, emerged as really key to successful EdTech implementation. DP2 engaged in what they described as human-centered design for their video content. And this involved gathering young people in the intervention countries together to feed into the initial story design, to do reviewing and provide feedback on the scripts as well as the rough cut animatics. So the viewership really was very, very integral to the design. This was perceived by staff to have been absolutely key to the interest and uptake of their My Better World series, which incidentally received an Emmy recently. Meanwhile, the IE project, the implementing partners with Leonard Cheshire employed people with visual impairments to ensure that the implementation of assistive devices was appropriate and accessible to project partners. So different form of community engagement there, which you can see in the first quote. On the programming side, MG Cubed, IE, and Let Our Girls Succeed all referred to using data in order to appropriately target limited resources for hardware distribution to the most marginalised students during COVID-19. Next one was feeding internal and or external knowledge and experience into the design. So interviewees also highlighted the importance of pre-existing knowledge and expertise of both EdTech and education programming as an important aspect of the project design. And where this is not present, such as with the GEAR team who had no previous experience of using EdTech, but instead they did have a very strong organisational culture of openness to learn and draw from the evidence and knowledge of others when introducing EdTech during COVID-19, even during fast-moving periods such as a crisis like the pandemic. Finally, in this theme was ongoing multi-layered M&E. So having really strong monitoring and evaluation processes, the scope to adapt based on M&E data, and having people on the ground to contextualise that data, as per the second quote that you can see from Maima Lango there. These were viewed by project staff to be critical to effective EdTech implementation, both during normal programming and during the COVID-19 school closures. There were countless examples within project documents and interviews of adaptations made based on this M&E data, both before and during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Great. Theme 2 was building and maintaining stakeholder relationships. So strong human relationships across all levels, from student level to government level, emerged as being critical to effective EdTech implementation. Nowhere was this better evidenced than during the COVID-19 school closures, which really exposed the limits of independent tech-supported study. So firstly, to caregiver relationships, MG Cubed and Let Our Girls Succeed project staff members both noted the importance of caregiver support for girls during learning and the pandemic, and highlighted some cases of negative caregiver attitudes or deprioritisation of girls' education, which resulted in girls having reduced device access and ability to engage in project activities. For GEAR, Let Our Girls Succeed, and MG Cube staff, raising awareness and assisting caregivers to support girls' education and EdTech access during school closures was therefore considered a vital part of their COVID-19 responses. And you can see that in the first point there. Secondly, peer support. This is a really interesting one. So according to some other research conducted quite recently by EDT and the EdTech Hub, radio lessons in the Let Our Girls Succeed project were not associated with higher performance in reading and mathematics, except when girls listened to the radio in groups. So Let Our Girls Succeed project staff elaborated on this with us at interview, explaining that students were able to complete the assignments set during radio lessons, and then they discussed answers in their groups, which helped them to sustain learning and motivation. Third one, community engagement. This was a key factor in successful EdTech implementation. Interviewees noted the value of building relationships with various community stakeholders, such as school leaders, teachers, PTAs, and broader community members as part of project preparation. And then allowing for broader community use of technological devices to increase community buy-in and sense of ownership of EdTech projects was also a very effective approach. In areas where communities may have had no prior access to TV, for example, the DP2 project decided to make schools centres for community viewing of TV programmes. They found that this promoted community-wide inclusion, as highlighted in the second quote on the slide there. And finally, government engagement. Some projects strongly emphasise the fostering of government relationships as a key driver of successful implementation and also sustainability. Partly as a result of fostering and nurturing these relationships, projects such as MG Cubed and DP2 were engaged as key partners in national COVID education responses. Through that positive trust and collaboration with government, MG Cubed, for example, were able to boost systemic inclusivity. So MG Cube's policy of incorporating sign language interpretation within their TV shows during COVID has since been adopted as a standard practice by Ghana's government distance learning agency. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. Great, so a brief word about comprehensive and continuous training. In relation to training, key factors that facilitated successful and equitable implementation included training multiple stakeholders. So staff across projects noted that providing guidance and training to stakeholders other than teachers, as well as teachers, ensured that projects were both more equitable and more sustainable. So for Imalango, this included training head teachers because they viewed them as crucial and instrumental to ensuring that schools engage with the project and establish inclusivity principles. And DP2 staff noted that training MOE officials enables them to support project activities more effectively, both during and beyond the project. It was really important that training be an ongoing, adaptive and differentiated process. Many project staff pointed out that ongoing training and follow-up through communities of practice was essential to consolidating skills and knowledge gains around tech, and this was really evident through Leonard Cheshire's project especially. Thirdly, this focus on gender equity and social inclusion alongside training on EdTech integration. I'll return to this in just a moment as well. Project staff considered GESI to be a core training component and crucial for ensuring equitable access to EdTech. So, for example, Leonard Cheshire asked teachers involved in the study to study MOOCs on how to work with visually impaired students prior to engaging with the project. And you can see the first quote there reflects that. Secondly, Imalango brought in a GESI specialist to promote equity of access, and in the second quote there, you can see how that was targeted. Next slide, please. The final theme, this one is really a major and in many ways overarching theme, and that was of ensuring that EdTech is appropriately situated in the context of other considerations of key equity priorities, rather than focusing on tech as a goal in itself. Within this, themes included the importance of designing inclusive, contextualized EdTech content. So the GEAR project staff cited examples of how they had designed radio show content to be inclusive and relevant, specifically to marginalized female students during the COVID-19 pandemic. They designed content to challenge gender stereotypes by featuring girls in a variety of stereotypically male professions during the radio programming, and they made girls' after-school aspirations broadcast focused. Similarly, DP2 subtitled all video content and reviewed all content using Wisenose software to check that it was suitable for students with low literacy levels. The first quote there really sums that up quite well from Leave No Girls Behind. The next sub-theme was delivering EdTech components within a holistic model. Really good example of this came from MG Cube. So they described several measures taken to ensure that distance learning sessions were as accessible as possible to the most marginalised students. This included inviting students who had recently become mothers to come to live lessons with their babies, using local languages, maintaining an informal, non-threatening atmosphere, and really practical things like providing snacks to ensure that students were not distracted by hunger. And the final sub-theme here is the blending of non-tech, low-tech and high-tech options to reach the most marginalised. So GEAR and Let Our Girls Succeed both demonstrated that effectiveness, the real effectiveness of this strategy. All GEAR staff reflected that their multi-pronged approach, including non-tech and low-tech methods, was central to the success of their COVID response. And the second quote there summarises that. Sorry, no, just about at time, just final few reflections. So whilst the findings are context specific, key cross-project learnings can be drawn that may be relevant to others seeking to optimize EdTech implementation and maximise impact on marginalised girls' learning. While conducting the study, we identified a few persistent gaps and limitations for consideration in future research and implementation. So the first is gaps in intervention effectiveness data. The availability of effectiveness data related to the sample projects and their use of EdTech was significantly limited by disruptions to data collection during COVID-19, with the most of the data that was available being either self-reported or anecdotal. Let Our Girls Succeed did devise a set of rapid assessments in numeracy and literacy, which they administered just after schools reopened. But it would have been great to see more impetus to really monitor and understand the impact of COVID adaptations through rigorous measurements, perhaps taking lessons from education in emergencies in this respect. The second gap that we found was in terms of sustainability data. So typically implementation focused research covers stages from design all the way through to longer term sustainment. However, there was a gap in the available data of the extent to which interventions and outcomes were actually sustained post-project, which limited the possibility of exploring this phase of the implementation process. This gap is largely related to the nature of the funding cycle in these types of externally funded projects. Since the sustainability of positive change is key to determining the long-term success of a project, this represents a significant and enduring gap in the evidence on EdTech in LMICs, which this study has unfortunately not been able to address. One way of resolving this could be for donors to consider providing a small amount of long-tail funding to implementing organisations for the monitoring of independent implementation post-project closure to develop a clearer understanding of the factors that feed into long-term effectiveness. Finally, while the findings affirm the importance of situating EdTech and taking an ecosystemic approach to the design and implementation of EdTech solutions, it is also really important to highlight the potential complexity behind such findings when viewed through an equity lens. So on the one hand, findings affirm the importance of taking a holistic and GESI-sensitive approach to programming in order to ensure that EdTech device activities are addressing rather than exacerbating the gender-digital divide. On the other hand, working with a contextual status quo where certain communities are significantly disadvantaged in terms of their access to tech, trying to push forward a digital transformation in these contexts arguably risks prolonging the wider systemic issue of digital inequity. This is something that was beyond the scope of this study to adequately address, but which we believe is deserving of ongoing discussion and consideration. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katrina. It was a real whistle-stop tour through a lot of data. For anyone who hasn't read the report or the learning brief, would highly recommend you do for a bit more context to what Katrina was saying. As I said at the beginning, if anyone has any questions, please hang on to them and we'll do them all at the end. But also feel free to keep writing in the chat. But for now, we'll move on to hear a bit more about some of a deep dive into some of those projects. So Laura from Peas is going to present. Thanks, Laura.
Great. Thank you very much. And just to clarify, I guess I haven't got the power to move along, right? So I'll just ask for slides to be moved. Great, thanks. Okay, so my name is Laura and I'm the Global Impact and Learning Lead at Peas. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about EdTech at Peas. So quick introduction to Peas for those who don't know us well. We have one of the largest and fastest growing secondary school networks in sub-Saharan Africa. Our students come from poorer households, particularly in rural areas, and they make faster learning progress than their peers. We also work hand in hand with government to improve the wider education system to ensure as many children as possible enjoy a quality education. And sorry, if you could move the slide along, sorry. Great. And then along again. Thank you. So over 50,000 students have been educated at Peas' network of 36 schools. 52% of those students are girls. And over 130,000 students have been reached through our work with 250 government partner schools. Most of Peas schools have IT labs and all have solar, electricity and lighting. And next slide, please. There are 5 key principles that guide the use of EdTech at Peas. Firstly, low maintenance costs to enable sustainability, which is a critical factor in our approach. Secondly, any EdTech solutions need to be able to work in offline and low power settings, particularly as we work in rural areas. Thirdly, EdTech solutions must be focused on the user, be easy to understand and be designed based on feedback from the users. Fourthly, scalable. We aim for our approaches to be scaled and replicated across government schools. And finally, targeted. We utilise digital systems that drive real impact. Next slide, please. Peas utilises EdTech in a range of areas, firstly in teaching and learning. So, for example, we're currently piloting a learning platform, Calibri, in Peas schools to aid in literacy and numeracy remedial support for students. Secondly, we use EdTech in school management. So, for example, School Tool Plus is a tailor-made database that's rolled out in all Peas schools, and it enables school leaders to use student and teacher data to aid decision-making. And finally, in programme delivery, for example, we've worked with the government in Uganda to develop a digital inspection tool that we are supporting government inspectors to use. Next slide, please. So we believe that it's important to design any EdTech intervention specifically to the context and needs of the student. When the pandemic hit and Ugandan schools closed in March 2020, Peas rapidly pivoted to implement a multi-pronged approach that involved using EdTech in new ways for us, including the broadcast of radio lessons, text messages sent to students and caregivers, and phone calls to students from teachers. And this was combined with non-tech approaches also. We learned many lessons regarding the use of EdTech during the process, many of which are highlighted in the excellent EdTech learning brief. And in the remaining time available, I thought I'd just talk a bit about Peas' experience in relation to a few particular points that are highlighted in that learning brief. Next slide, please. Firstly, the importance of strong multi-layered monitoring and evaluation of EdTech approaches. So Peas conducted phone surveys with students throughout the pandemic and with caregivers and teachers. These were critical in helping us to understand what was and wasn't working and where adaptations needed to be made. We used a range of tracking tools, and finally the GECT N-line evaluation also provided some really important insights. A good example of the monitoring and evaluation approach in action would be in relation to the SMS intervention. So in Uganda, the language of instruction at secondary school level is English, and our students do all speak English, and text messages were therefore initially sent to students in English. However, M&E phone surveys showed that caregivers were often the gatekeepers for the household mobile phone and not always passing on the SMS content to the student. Furthermore, an external evaluation found that the odds of students with more highly educated parents being more likely to find the messages helpful was 1.32 times greater than students with less well-educated parents. So what we concluded was that potentially the less well-educated parents who were less likely to speak English were not necessarily passing on the SMSs to the students. And so in response to these findings, Pease began sending texts in a range of local languages. Next slide, please. Secondly, Pease continues to see EdTech as ideally part of a multi-pronged approach, particularly in a context such as rural Uganda. Combining low tech with no tech is important in order to reach as many students as possible, including the poorest and most vulnerable. Pease GECT N9 evaluation found that most students reported participating in at least one of Pease remote learning approaches. Around 7% of all students did not engage with any forms of EdTech, and this was roughly equal split by gender. This suggests no tech approaches were also remaining worthwhile during the pandemic. And there was no single activity that all students accessed, reflecting the fact that students live in a range of situations and face differing barriers. I could say more and I'd be happy to speak further, but I'll leave it there due to time and pass on to ESO. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Flora, and thanks for keeping it short. Hopefully you can expand more when we have a chat later. Mark and Shika, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear more and learn some of our insights. We'll be sharing our Shikai Radio initiative of Sister for Sister. Mark and I'll be doing this presentation jointly. First, we'll be sharing our inclusive education framework at the global level. Then we'll be discussing much more on the Sister for Sister education program and dive into the radio program initiative. So I'll request Mark to share our global inclusive education framework. And next slide, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Mark Rotich, and I'm the global lead for girls' education and inclusion at the VSO, and happy to share with us very briefly about the VSO inclusive education, and then I'll pass it back to my colleague to continue. So let me start by saying that VSO uses the volunteerism for development, which is really a very good approach of tapping into international volunteers and also local volunteers and blending that to be able to empower the primary actors to lead and design the projects they want to do. And in this approach, we are really very pleased to note that our approach leads to sustainable development. It also leads to kind of empowering the primary actors. Our key primary actors are generally the marginalized communities, girls as well, and we also focus on those who are ethnic minorities. They also include those who might be refugees or having other forms of marginalization and also other forms of exclusion. Our approach to the inclusive education in VSO really has a few domains that have been shared with us. We actually focus on 4 domains where we are trying to reach, as I mentioned, the most marginalized and the most vulnerable children. And just one note, just before I come into these 4 domains, as VSO, we work in three kind of main areas, which is education, health, and livelihoods. And we find a lot of integration between the three kind of sectors. So there are a lot of things that we actually do jointly in the health and also with livelihoods. And our domains for our inclusive education includes, first of all, targeting the individuals. And these are the primary actors that I mentioned, which are largely the vulnerable children, the youth. And we aim to increase their participation in our education programs to achieve the levels of education that is appropriate to their age, is also appropriate to their learning objectives. So we also include things like life skills. We also include other survival kind of education for the individuals. The second domain that we use is really the family and community. And you'll realize that a lot of the barriers to some of these marginalized hinges around the attitudes and the behaviors at the family and the community level. So we aim to work with the family and community to change attitudes and to address some of these negative social norms that happen within the family and household and communities, essentially to try and address issues of vulnerability, address issues of risks, and also create an enabling environment for our learners. So that's our second critical kind of main domain. And the third one is, as you may know, is that all this happens within a system. And when we are looking at education sector, we're looking at the education system. So we're looking at the school environment. We are looking at about the educators, their confidence, their level of content, and how they handle issues like gender, how they use the skills they have in terms of addressing some of these barriers that may happen within the school. So our third component is really looking at the system itself and looking at how the school operates and the system that's surrounding the school. And finally, what we are looking at is anchoring most of our reforms and most of our work at policy levels so as to be able to be sustainable. We're looking at some of the practices that might be hindering inclusive education. We're looking at some of the policy environment that may be an entrance to accountability. And we work with the primary actors, the governments, and all other like-minded organizations to address the policies and to ensure that we put in place a system and policies that allow that we reach the most marginalized and that the most marginalized enjoy enhanced lives and will be able to get the equitable education. And from here, I'll hand over to my colleague to tell us more about the specific projects, because we do a lot of projects in different countries. And one of this is what my colleague will share with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark said, most of our projects consider all those different domains of change, and same is also for the Sister for Sister education program. This program had aimed to improve access to quality education for the girls so that they can transition to the basic as well as and then to the secondary education and are empowered to leave school so that they are able to secure a sustainable livelihood. So if we see our program, it covers all the girls' journey from access, then transition to the higher education, then complete it so that they are able to lead a dignified life. And the major focus area of our project, especially for the Sister for Sister, is we made efforts on increasing attendance of the girls. As Mark said, we in Nepal we also have very much harmful norms and the practices that creates barriers for the girls and the marginalized children to access education. So community engagement in promoting girls' education is also another area, and improving teachers' quality as well as improving school governance so that there is much more gender responsive and enabling environment. And with the onset of the COVID, there was the closure of all those education institutes, and we realized that we need the alternative way, and that enabled us to venture into the radio program Sikai Radio Initiative. Next slide, please. Next slide. And with the radio program, we focus much more for the children in the grades 9 and 10, and we use this as the creating a virtual environment so that the access of education is continued with the support from the virtual teachers. And this is also another new teaching methodology to cope with the closures due to COVID-19 pandemic, and that can also be used for other pandemics. We didn't just rely on the radio platform, we also broadcasted it through different social media, and we were able to reach 431,000 people who listen to our programs, and around 1,500 people also provided us their voices through the mobile phone. If we see the listener, still we need to increase the access of the girls, because it is only 32%. Next slide, please. And another aspect of this radio program is that we also conducted weekly monitoring to ensure effectiveness of the program. And we found that 94% indicated that they learned health, population, and education, 96% on maths, 93 on English, and 93 on science. It clearly indicates that the effectiveness of the radio program was very high, and it also helped in continue learning outcomes even during the closure. It is especially the age of the adolescent that they just wanted to be distracted, and these programs helped on providing continuity of the learning. Next slide, please. The key learning of this radio program, as shared by other team members, we shouldn't be just relying it only as a radio program. We need to collaborate with the Ministry of the Education, Science and Technology, in our case, and CHRD, and it helped us in generating the content that is based on the curriculum, as well as help in institutionalizing, ensuring that this is based on the curriculum, and this is also the package that can also be used for other pandemics. And it is not only the government. We also had the large pool of the community volunteers who use those radio programs as the key platform to share some of the learning outcomes and motivate other girls and the children to continue the learning. And they are also our backbone to collecting the feedback, so that we can use those feedback for improving ourselves with the help of the experts. So it is not the content generated by the VSO, it was the content generated by the expert who had much more expertise on the curriculum development. So with the wider engagement of the community, it also helped on strengthening the ownership of the community, because it was changed based on the feedback. Another learning we learned was nowadays radio program alone, it is not sufficient. We also need to use different social media platforms, especially which our teenagers use, to make much more wider use of those platforms. And we also succeeded. We could reach to much more wider audience, and also collect the feedback. And it also provided our big sister as the means to use those platforms to continue motivate the younger sister, as well as engage the parents to break the cultural social norms that creates barrier in accessing education. And we are very much thankful to everyone, especially our big sister, who has been our baton of success to ensure they are the one who are also proving that girls can also lead and girls can also make changes in the society. And radio was just the means to make sure that demonstrated leadership of the girls and women.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Shika, and thanks so much, Mark. I've done a bad job of sharing, so instead of half an hour to have questions and discussions, we only have 10 minutes. But I did want to just say again, if anyone has any questions, please put them. There's some coming in on the chat already. Really excellent presentations and a wealth of detail, I thought. And I think, you know, one of the things that I always find really interesting about the work of the EdTech Hub and more generally work on EdTech is how like the tech is almost the least important part of these interventions often. So you'll see from the results of the study that you know, evidence-informed design, building and maintaining relationships, and comprehensive and continuous training were as important, if not more important, than the tech. So I think that's always something good to remember as we move forward. I just saw a hand up. Do you want to put your hand back up? Great. Please come in. Tina, was it Tina Furo? Not sure how to say your name. No. Okay, I'm going to ask a question from the chat, which is for Mark and Shika. Could you tell us a bit more about your experience with addressing negative attitudes and social norms within communities? What were the challenges involved, and how can projects working in this area ensure that people do not revert to negative attitudes after some time? Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you very much, Ansari, for your valuable question. Changing harmful social norms and practices is not that easy, but it's possible. It is possible when we are systematic and when we do the analysis of what are the harmful social norms and the practices, what are the sanctions that are present in the society if we do not follow those harmful norms and practices in the name of continuing our social reputation or our culture. So if we understand what are the harmful social norms and practices, what are the sanctions, then we also need to know who are our champions in the society, because we also need to mobilize our champions of the change who can expand those smaller changes in the community. In our case, I can give the example of the Big Sister. In our society, there is so much of the impression that girls and women cannot lead. But if the Big Sisters are making changes in the society, making sure that their younger girls go to the schools and secure good marks, and they are also into the different education profession, into different social service profession, and these Big Sisters are now making the impression that yes, girls and women can also lead. So with the presence of those role models, then you can change those impressions and the negative attitudes. But you are true that we need to make sure that those role models are also supported. Those role models also have much more coping mechanism and the safety nets, so that those role models continue to inspire others and those negative attitudes are changed. But it will take much more patience, but it can definitely, the transformation is possible. I can go on, and I'm sure the time is limited. So
thanks, Shika, that was inspiring. Emmanuel, do you want to come in? I don't know if something is happening, but unfortunately people with their hands up aren't able to come in, it looks like. So maybe if you have a question, please just put it in the chat. There's a question here from Damasani, a general question to all presenters. From your experience, what are the future trends of emerging technologies that show promise in advancing girls' education? And if I may, I'm going to take Chair's prerogative. I'd love just to add to that, to say, how is this different from what is promising for general EdTech? Is there anything specific about girls that you can add to your answers? Katrina, maybe would you be able to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for this question. It's yeah, really goes to the heart of a lot of the things that we've been talking about. I think I'd firstly go back to the central point that we're making, that however kind of innovative a technology is, if it's not appropriate to the infrastructure around in the particular area of implementation, it doesn't matter how, you know, how whizzy it is, how groundbreaking it is, if it's not appropriate for that community, it's not going to have the desired effect. So I think we should always return to that question of context and suitability and feasibility before we sort of pinpoint any one innovation. That said, I think that I've been reading some really interesting things lately that we also saw very briefly in this study as well, around really clever technologies that are kind of localized servers and cache boxes and things that can really help to make sure that there's access to very localized networks in very remote and rural areas, which gives students and teachers access to educational resources, tech-based educational resources, which can be used again and again and again and again. They don't need to be reproduced in a costly way in the way that textbooks would, for example, and to give those, to provide that access without having to deal with these kind of much larger issues of kind of internet infrastructure across the whole country, being able to kind of bypass that on a local level. There's some really interesting and exciting work happening about that at the moment. So I would probably, I'd probably sort of point towards those kind of local server solutions. I think that's quite an interesting area for us to be looking at.
Great, thanks so much. Laura, did you want to add anything on that question?
Yeah, sure. So I would suggest maybe apps for teachers. So at Pease, where a priority for this year is to develop an app for teachers to use on their smartphones to aid their teaching in the classroom. You know, kind of easy access tools like that can be really beneficial. And in terms of EdTech tools, particularly for girls, I guess similar to what Kat was saying, maybe rather than it being different EdTech solutions, just thinking about how we utilize them differently for girls and boys. So we found that radio programs, for example, on the scheduling side, both boys and girls had different schedules according to their responsibilities in the household and things. So really important to take that into account. Similarly, I talked a bit about the issue with mobile phones. Girls had more difficulty in accessing the phones, and therefore that solutions need to be thought through. So rather than different EdTech solutions, just different approaches with those same solutions, if that makes sense.
Really helpful answer. Thanks, Laura. Another question is coming in the chat, which is, how is the Girls' Education Challenge tailoring its approach to integrating technology in education to specifically address the social, economic and cultural factors influencing girls' learning? So I think we heard a bit about that in both of your answers. But Mark, I realise I haven't asked you any questions yet. Is there anything you'd like to add specifically on that? And if anyone from the GEC team wants to come in, obviously feel free. But Mark, you go first.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the main issue there actually is the different economic and social cultural factors. And I think my colleagues have already mentioned about it, that we need to understand those economic and cultural factors in order for us to be able to integrate technology, because some of it could be to do with access. Some of it could be just having even teachers to know and how to use the technology itself. So sometimes we just think that having technology in front of the users is sufficient, but I think we probably need to know that there is also an element that it's good to have teachers also be able to know and be able to use the technology. And there could also be a bit of some of the issues to do with the sustainability of those technologies as well, because some of these gadgets that are being used may not be maintained, and so that some of those factors could be related to the economic issues. So I think my main emphasis here is also make sure that the other auxiliary like teachers are involved in the use and the deployment of technology. Thank you.
Great answer, Mark. Thank you. Another question has just come in from Nazia. A lot of the solutions evolved during the COVID period. Do you think it could also be an option to be implemented during a normal situation, particularly, for example, in implementing education in emergencies? Laura's just come back on screen, so maybe she wants to go first, but that's, I think, to everyone.
Yeah, don't mean if someone else wants to go first, that's fine. Okay, well, just briefly, I would say at Peas, we still consider face-to-face to be the ideal. So in normal situations, certainly for us, we want teachers and students to be together in a classroom. Therefore, we wouldn't have that same focus on remote learning. But definitely in education in emergencies, we're really pleased that we've developed this experience now. So when, fingers crossed, no more crises, but if there is one, it was definitely an effective approach to remote learning and can be utilised again, I think. That's our experience.
Thanks very much. Katrina, would you like to add? You've got 1 minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to agree with what Laura said, to be honest, I think that we found through our research that radio had a huge amount of potential in it, and specifically just wanted to sort of draw everyone's attention back to that finding around group learning being associated with a powerful kind of catalyst for successful radio implementation. So I think in some of the projects that there was an intention to do more of this kind of group learning, which was associated with radio, but they found actually that there were a lot of barriers for them in terms of physical movement, so they couldn't get the teachers and support workers to actually go in and help facilitate that. However, in some of the extremely rural communities, a lot of the teachers and community health volunteers, in the case of Let Our Girls Succeed, I think it was, they ended up kind of playing that role within their communities during lockdown. So I don't see why, if without those restrictions of movement there, I think there's great potential in having these kind of radio group lessons continue, and probably would be even more successful now that there's the freedom of movement for facilitators to come and implement that in a bit more of a systematic way. So yeah, it seems to be something that I think there's definite mileage in.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I think that's a good note to end on. Thanks so much to Katrina and Mark and Laura and Shika for excellent presentations. And yeah, I guess just to wrap up, I think my main takeaway from today is that tech is an excellent tool to reach marginalised girls, but it's just one tool of many, right? So we need to contextualise it. We need to think about it as an education tool rather than as a tech first solution. Really enjoyed the presentations. I'm sorry we couldn't hear you for longer, and thanks to the GEC team for having us all. Have a lovely day, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everybody.